A father left his son at the edge of a downtown park, clutching a crumpled baseball and a promise that sounded like a lie. What followed would unravel reputations, redraw family lines, and hinge on the kindness of a man with more money than most people see in a lifetime. Did it save him or expose deeper wounds? Tell us where you are watching from, and if you want more stories like this, please subscribe. Ethan was 12, scuffed sneakers, a chipped front tooth, and a silence that felt heavier than his small backpack. The answer to what happened next is coming soon. This is a story about abandonment, guilt, and an unlikely generosity that opened a new kind of home. The park smelled of wet asphalt and fried food, the late summer air sticky against Ethan's neck like a hand that would not let go. Pigeons fluttered in a circle, a bus hissed at the curb, and a public bench with peeling paint held the only witness to a furtive goodbye. Ethan sat with his knees pulled to his chest, fingers worrying at the seam of a baseball, listening to footsteps on gravel that grew distant. He watched the man walk away and felt something inside him close like an old door. A woman walking her dog paused, then moved on. A teenager with earbuds glanced up briefly and turned his face away. No one stopped. A municipal streetlight buzzed overhead with a high, impatient sound. Ethan tasted copper in his mouth and could not tell if it was fear or the leftover of swallowed anger. "Are you okay?" the dog walker, Marie, asked, voice soft with a southern accent, kneeling a little distance away. Her hands smelled like soap and citrus. Ethan did not answer for a long breath. His palm briefly touched the baseball, smudged finger ink on the leather where someone had written a name. "He said he would come back," Ethan said finally, voice small and threadbare from too many silences. "Who said that?" Marie asked, looking over at the path as if the man might return with an answer. "My dad," Ethan said. "He had a meeting, and he said I should wait. He gave me the ball. He said he would come right back." A cyclist stopped and asked if they needed help. Ethan shook his head. The cyclist pedaled off, the chain clinking, a bell chiming twice, the sound bright and ordinary against the rawness of abandonment. The dog pulled on its leash and seemed to know the child needed warmth that no one could afford to give right then. Ethan smelled smoke from a nearby food cart and a sting of exhaust from idling cars. His stomach made a sound. The park clock above the community center read 4:17 p.m., each minute glassy on its own, indifferent. "What's your name?" Marie asked after a while, as if names could repair the raw map of things that had happened. "Ethan," he said. He sounded older than 12, or perhaps younger, time-worn at the edges. The bench felt like a small island. He squeezed the baseball until his knuckles whitened. His jacket smelled faintly of motor oil and bleach, the fabric thin at the cuffs. Marie sat and offered him a bottle of water. He drank, the cold liquid clinking in his bones and setting off a little shiver. The world continued. Bus brakes, distant laughter, a siren fading, and simultaneously paused in a small circle around the bench where a child waited on a promise. That bench became the scene that set everything in motion. And within hours, the park was a quieter kind of courtroom, where witnesses would later be asked to tell what they had seen and what they had not. An officer would take notes that smelled of paper and ballpoint ink. A social worker would fingerprint the edges of the moment with procedural calm. A millionaire would later claim he had been passing by on a whim. A family lawyer would read records and find fingerprints of hurt in margins where no one had bothered to look. But first, the scene was a small, ordinary place of small, ordinary betrayals. Ethan's backstory had roots in a house that once held laughter loud enough to echo. His mother left when he was 5, leaving a note with a phone number that would never be answered. His father, Marcus, a once steady presence, had worn 3 jobs at once for several years, working nights at a warehouse, mornings as a high school janitor, and afternoons driving a taxi when needed. Marcus loved his son with a stern, practical love that showed up in packed lunches and rules about homework, and he failed with a shame that sat like a knot in his chest. There were times Marcus read Ethan's stories in a voice roughened by late nights, and there were other times he slammed doors so hard the pictures trembled. Neighbors knew him as good enough, someone who tried, and his friends called him dependable, in the way you call someone dependable when you have seen them crawl through mud to get you a ladder. The magnet for the eventual abandonment was not a single night of anger, but months of pressure. Marcus had been diagnosed with a medical condition that taxed both the body and wallet. Nights at Jefferson Medical Center blurred with calls from collections, and a letter once slid under their door like a small blade. He had taken out loans, sold a watch that had been his father's, and slept in the car on nights when he could not afford both the heat and the rent. Pride and fear tangled, and Marcus began to believe his son would be better with someone else, someone who could offer predictability and open doors the way money could. The thought buckled him, because even as he arranged grocery lists and tucked Ethan's shirt sleeves, he began to rehearse escape routes. For the noise that never left. Marcus's backstory deserves a close look because it explains but does not excuse. He had a childhood of his own, in a small town by the river where his mother taught him to set traps for raccoons and to fix a roof with hands that smelled of cedar. He had been the first in his family to go to college until a scholarship lapsed and illness took his plan away. Responsibility fell on him early. He learned to measure every choice by survival. He was a man who could fix a leaky pipe in the dark and write a note so carefully that you could see the burr of regret under every letter. Yet he also had a temper, a tendency to believe that he could contain catastrophe if he just tightened his fists enough. That was his flaw, and it mattered the day he decided a promise could be temporary. All of this was in the months before Ethan sat on that bench. Marcus argued with hospital bill collectors down the phone, the sound like a heavy hinge. He missed work because his sleep thinned. One night, in a fluorescent-lit kitchen, he said to himself out loud a sentence that would later replay like a curse. "I cannot give him what he needs. Maybe someone else can." It was a sentence that slid from resignation into action the moment his shame convinced him that surrender would be a kinder weapon than theft. The decision to leave his son was shaped by good intentions burned to ash, by a belief that absence might be rescue if the world could be tricked into thinking he had chosen well. That belief would be his indictment. The moment of abandonment happened faster than anyone would later describe without pity. Marcus had woken earlier than usual, the city still gray with sleep, grabbing Ethan's hand in the half-light and telling him they would go to see a new apartment, a promise stitched with lies. Ethan clutched his backpack and the old baseball, the leather soft under his fingertips. Marcus drove the rusted sedan with a radio playing distant talk about the weather. His hands were sweaty at the wheel. They pulled up near the park where the sounds were gentler, where a bench seemed private. Then he said the words as if rehearsed. "Wait here, I will be right back," he told Ethan, voice low and tight. "I need to run inside. A quick meeting. I will be back before the sun sets." Ethan watched him go. The door shut with a small thump that felt like a verdict. Marcus walked away with his head bowed, the city swallowing him like a man swallowed by his own choices. As he walked, he kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see the boy running after him. He told himself he would return, that he would make a call and be back in minutes. Minutes became a fog of errands and avoidance. Marcus stood at a payphone and decided to keep walking. He found a bus stop bench and sat down with his wallet turned inside out. He put his face in his hands and felt the rawness of what he had done. The confession he made to himself there was not to Ethan, but to the reflection in a shop window. "I thought I was saving him. I thought I was doing the right thing." The reaction of the community to the abandoned child was immediate in some ways and sluggish in others. Marie, the dog walker, called 911. Officer Daniels arrived with bright boots and a careful voice, smelling of rain on his jacket, and radioed in the report. "Child alone on bench. Male adult left area," he said, clipboard tapping like a metronome. Ethan answered questions in a voice that resembled a small, cracked bell. "My name is Ethan. My dad said he would be right back. he told Officer Daniels, and then repeated the name Marcus when asked. The officer called Riverside Social Services and told them a child was on site. The scene filled with names. Marie gave a statement. Javier, the bus driver who had stopped to tie a shoelace, described the man leaving as hurried and thin. Lily Chen from the coffee shop across the street brought a paper cup of warm cocoa and wiped Ethan's nose with a napkin, hands that smelled faintly of cardamom. Rosa Garcia from the shelter drove by and later volunteered to sit with the child until social services arrived, offering the worn blanket from her car, the way people offer blankets when they mean comfort. A cluster of witnesses learned each other's names, because naming is a way of making things real and accountable. Within 90 minutes, a social worker arrived, Claire Thompson from Riverside Social Services, hair tied back in a practical bun, a bag with forms, and a quiet intensity. She smelled faintly of lavender and printer toner. Claire sat down and asked gentle questions, her voice leveling the chaos into something that could be recorded and acted upon. "Ethan, can you tell me what happened? Is there a phone number? Do you know where your dad works?" she asked, pen poised like a judge's hammer. Ethan answered, hands shaking, and handed over a half-folded scrap of paper with Marcus's name written in a hurry. Claire instructed Officer Daniels to place Ethan in protective custody while they located a caregiver. "We will make sure you are safe," she said, and the words were both a promise and a procedural step. This is where procedure met pain. When a child is reported, Child Protective Services initiates an emergency assessment. An emergency removal can be enacted with a 72-hour temporary hold. A dependency petition is typically filed within 24 to 48 hours, and a shelter hearing is set within 72 hours, accompanied by a medical exam, background checks, and a home study for any potential caregiver. These are legal safety nets designed to prioritize the child's health while the courts determine next steps, balancing urgency with rights. The technical explanation did not quiet the ache of the moment. Instead, it offered structure so social services could act decisively. Claire organized transport to a local pediatric clinic and coordinated with Jefferson Medical Center for a quick check. Dr. Patel examined Ethan, checking for bruises, listened to his chest where the breath came shallow, swabbing and noting just in case. The medical room smelled of antiseptic and lemon cleaner, the fluorescent lights sharp as small accusations. Ethan did not cry in the clinic. Tears felt like an admission that would make him brittle. Instead, he watched the corners of the room, the clock, the humming of the fluorescent light, and the soft swish of the nurse's sneakers. The story takes a turn. The afternoon, a man in an expensive gray coat stopped by the park on his way to an art opening. Jonathan Reed, 61, a tech entrepreneur turned philanthropist whose name dominated a building plaque downtown, had decided to walk rather than be driven because he liked the way the city whispered its secrets when you were on foot. He noticed Ethan, the ball with the scrawled name, and the way the child seemed smaller than the space around him. Jonathan had a private life crowded with urgency and board meetings, but he also had, beneath his tailored suits and press releases, a tenderness that often surprised people who knew him only by headlines. Jonathan knelt down without a fanfare, and his cologne smelled of cedar and coffee. He talked to Ethan like he was talking to someone with a complicated manual that needed careful reading. "What's your name?" he asked, and Ethan said it. Jonathan listened, and the way he listened mattered, because most adults had already looked away. He placed his hand briefly on Ethan's shoulder, a contact that felt like a small anchoring. "I'm going to make sure someone here knows you are okay," he said. The sentence surprised Ethan because it was the first time a stranger had offered certainty since the bench had become his world. What followed between Jonathan and Ethan grew into the central pivot of the narrative. Jonathan called the clinic and wanted to stay until officials arrived. Claire, used to 1,000 forms of human drama, accepted his presence with pragmatic gratitude. "We have protocol," she told him, but her eyes softened. Jonathan offered to pay for any immediate needs on the spot, producing a card with a thin blue emblem. He spoke quietly to Dr. Patel and the nurse, and then to Officer Daniels. His role could have ended there.
Instead, Jonathan asked if there was any way he could help more, not out of headline seeking, but out of a personal disquiet he could not ignore. The first dialogue between Ethan and Jonathan felt minor and enormous at once. "Do you like
Baseball? Jonathan asked, pointing to the ball. I like it, Ethan answered, the single syllable carrying a load. My dad taught me once, Ethan said, and he looked down. He promised to come back. People sometimes make promises they think will help them sleep, Jonathan said. Some promises are kept, some are broken, but sometimes someone else can keep a promise for you. Ethan blinked. Can you keep it? He asked. Jonathan hesitated, then nodded. I can try. That attempt would not be simple. Claire explained the legal paths. Jonathan offered financial resources and legal contacts. And a decision unfolded to place Ethan in temporary foster care with Rosa Garcia until a longer-term plan could be made. Rosa welcomed him in, stove warm with cumin and garlic, her apartment filled with the hum of a television and photographs of 3 grown children who called weekly. She was a short woman with kind hands and a voice that wrapped itself around stories like a blanket. She smelled faintly of cinnamon. We will make soup, she told Ethan, and you will sleep a good night, I promise. Ethan slept in a bed that night with blankets that were not as thin as the ones in the shelter, and the sound of Rosa's radio gave the apartment a slow, trusted rhythm. Jonathan did not vanish. He called with questions about Ethan's school and volunteered to contact the district and sponsor a scholarship for after-school programs. He gave Claire the name of a lawyer, Sarah Bennett, who had a steady hand with family court and a folder of precedents that could, if needed, be marshaled. Jonathan arranged for Ethan to see a therapist, and the therapist's name would later become important. Dr. Avery Mendoza worked with children who had experienced trauma and had a way of coaxing feelings into language. She had hair like soft smoke and a manner that felt safe. She provided the first clinical assessment and recommended weekly sessions, noting Ethan's guardedness and the way he tracked adults as if they might flee at any moment. As the investigation unfolded, the city offered its roster of characters. Officer Daniels documented Marcus's absence. Claire traced phone records and located a string of unpaid notices and a few calls to shelters. Sarah Bennett filed papers indicating intent to seek temporary guardianship for Ethan on behalf of Jonathan Reed, with the caveat that Jonathan wanted to ensure any legal step would be in Ethan's best interest and not an attempt to rush adoption before proper processes. Marcus was located 3 days later, sleeping on a park bench near a laundromat, his coat pulled tight around him. He smelled like old cigarettes and rain. When Claire approached him and said his name, he looked as if someone had opened a door into a room he had been avoiding for years. The scene of their reunion was raw and human. Marcus sat on a plastic chair at the social services office, the fluorescent light making his eyes look small and red. He had been brought in for questioning and offered water. "Where have you been?" Ethan asked, the question a blade disguised as curiosity. Marcus started to speak, then stopped. His hands trembled. "I thought I could make things better," he said. "I am so sorry, son." Ethan's eyes hardened, a young judge issuing a verdict. "You left me," he said, and the sentence landed like a stone. Marcus reached for him, then retreated, as if he feared the warmth might burn. The confrontation with Marcus required an extended dialogue to peel back layers. Claire sat between them, motioning for patience. "We need to go through what happened, Marcus," she said, voice steady. "We will hear everything, and then the court will decide what is best for Ethan." Marcus talked, sometimes incoherently, about bills and the suffocation of responsibility, about the shame that had made his palms slick. He spoke of nights when he had cried alone in a car, of the watch he sold, of trying to catch his breath. Ethan listened, and then asked a question only a child could ask, and only an abandoned child would ask. "Did you ever think of me when you left?" Marcus buried his face in his hands, like a man looking for a place to hide. "Every second," he said. This confrontation led to courtroom moments that would test every moral intuition. Sarah Bennett argued that Jonathan's involvement should be considered altruistic, but scrutinized. The state, represented by Assistant County Attorney Malik Ross, filed a petition to determine custody with the child's best interest as the standard. The court procedures were meticulous. Judge Ramirez presided, a woman with a voice that carried the gravity of law, reading the statutes like someone reading the contours of a wound. Evidence was presented, witness statements read aloud, and Dr. Mendoza summarized Ethan's psychological profile. There were extended exchanges, 10 to 13 turns of dialogue in the courtroom, between lawyers, the judge, social workers, and the witnesses, because the stakes demanded thoroughness, and because the law moves in sentences and pauses. "Has Mr. Reed attempted to exert influence?" Malik asked Jonathan at one hearing, voice measured. "No," Jonathan replied. "I came here because I could not walk away." "Are you proposing guardianship or adoption?" Sarah Bennett asked, pen poised. "Guardianship first," Jonathan said. "If that is in Ethan's best interest, we will consider next steps carefully." "Mr. Marcus, do you relinquish your rights?" Judge Ramirez asked at one tense moment. And Marcus, worn thin, said he could not give away his son, but conceded he needed help and had been incapable of providing stability. The judge leaned forward and asked about services and monitoring. The tensions in the room were sensory as much as verbal. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and lemon oil. The air conditioning hummed. The judge's gavel had the familiar dry thwack that made everyone sit straighter. Ethan's sneakers squeaked against tiled floor as shifted, tiny sounds marking an enormous decision. Throughout this period, the community reacted in small and large ways. Lily Chen from the coffee shop organized a fundraiser, collecting small bills in her tip jar, insisting that a small town of strangers could stack up to something significant. Marcus's sister, Elena, a schoolteacher, wrote letters pleading for a plan that allowed Marcus the chance to prove he could parent. Rosa Garcia visited Ethan and asked if he wanted to help with dinner and watched him make a small casserole with focus that momentarily loosened worry in his eyes. Each person became an instrument in a larger, improvisational attempt to hold a child safe while the legal pages turned. Ethan's life in his temporary home with Rosa and the therapeutic sessions with Dr. Mendoza marked slow, complicated progress. Mornings began with the smell of coffee and the scrape of spoons. Ethan learned to brush his teeth without rushing. He enrolled back in school and sat next to classmates who asked whispered questions. A teacher, Mr. Henderson, noticed his quiet and offered a place in the after-school baseball program. Practices were held under floodlights that smelled of oil and rubber, and the leather of the baseball connected him to a past memory, as if someone had sewn a thread between then and now. He caught balls awkwardly at first, and then improved. His hands learned to trust again. Therapy used play and narrative. Dr. Mendoza asked Ethan to draw a safe place, then to describe it. He drew a small house with a tree and a swing, and labeled the swing with the word promise. Slowly, he learned to put words to the ways he had been hurt. "When people leave, I tighten my chest like I am bracing for a storm," he said once. Sessions included breathing exercises, naming feelings, and establishing predictable routines that would offset unpredictability. At school, the counselor, Miss Patel, coordinated with Dr. Mendoza to ensure Ethan had support during transitions. The list of professionals and helpers grew. Claire Thompson checked in weekly, Officer Daniels offered to help with paperwork, and Sarah Bennett explained legal options in terms Ethan could understand. The social fabric around Ethan now included 5 to 8 named secondary characters who acted and reacted in concrete ways. Rosa Garcia making dinners and attending parent-teacher conferences. Lily Chen organizing community support. Mr. Henderson coaching baseball. Claire Thompson filing reports. Dr. Avery Mendoza holding therapy sessions. Malik Ross representing the state in court. Sarah Bennett advocating in legal rooms, and Judge Ramirez deciding with a gavel measured by law and compassion. Each person left fingerprints on Ethan's story. Their names repeated in conversations, in forms, in the small checks and calls that signaled care. Moments of tension multiplied and lengthened. When Marcus sought supervised visitation, the first meeting in a bright visitation room became a 2-paragraph stretch of suspense. The air smelled of disinfectant and coffee.
Marcus arrived with his hands folded,
eyes pleading. Ethan watched, shoulders wrapped in a hoodie, the fabric smelling of detergent. "I missed your soccer match," Marcus said. "I tried to call." Ethan studied him for a long minute and asked, "Why didn't you come?" Marcus's voice broke. "I was trying to fix things," he said. "I know that does not help. I am sorry." The visit ended with a handshake that felt like an unfinished story, and both men left the room changed in small, complicated ways. The biggest tension arrived at the final guardianship hearing. The courtroom again filled with the same characters, the air thick with the ache of decisions. Sarah Bennett argued that Jonathan Reed could provide stability and resources while committing to transparent processes and oversight. Malik Ross reminded the court that the state required careful balancing of parental rights and the child's best interests. Marcus sat with his hands clasped, and Ethan watched, the child who had learned to measure words for weight. The exchange of questions and answers stretched into long turns as lawyers cross-examined witnesses, probing motives and testing promises. Judge Ramirez asked pointed questions about monitoring, about the length and terms of guardianship, and about services to reunite father and son if appropriate. "Mr. Reed," the judge asked by the end of the hearing, "are you prepared to be accountable to the court and the child welfare system in partnership with Riverside Social Services?" "Yes," Jonathan said simply, "I will be accountable." "Mr. Marcus," she asked, "do you have a plan to address the conditions that led to the removal and to pursue regaining custody if this is in your interest and the child's?" "I have enrolled in a job program and counseling," Marcus answered, voice shaking. "I want to be my son's father." The judge paused, a long human heartbeat, then issued an interim guardianship to Jonathan, with a detailed plan of supervised contact for Marcus and a reunification track if Marcus completed certain milestones over a 6-month period. The gavel landed with the decisive sound of law and mercy together. Ethan did not immediately smile. Instead, he registered the world as softer at the edges, as if a painful seam had been sewn closed for now. Life under Jonathan's guardianship meant structure and scrutiny. Jonathan set up a fund for Ethan's education and therapy, and personally visited on weekends at first, then less as boundaries became healthy. He introduced Ethan to tutors and to a world of quiet philanthropy, where money did not erase trauma, but could buy opportunities for repair. Jonathan took care not to dominate. He learned to ask rather than to command, and to listen more than he spoke. The bond between them grew painstakingly. Jonathan coached Ethan's baseball practice with clumsy enthusiasm, hands that had signed corporate deals now fumbling with a mitt. Ethan, who had once accepted a promise with suspicion, began to respond to consistency. There were small setbacks. Once, a social worker reported a missed therapy appointment, and the court required Jonathan to explain the lapse. He attended hearings, wrote progress reports, and agreed to quarterly reviews. Marcus made progress too. He completed a job training program and attended parenting classes coordinated by Riverside Social Services. The road back for him was neither linear nor guaranteed. Sometimes he would miss a call, then a meeting, then a visit, and each absence bit into the fragile trust between him and Ethan. Sometimes he would show up on time and bring a small toy that meant little and everything at once. The slice of life that became Ethan's new home included ordinary and extraordinary days. Rosa still made Sunday dinners, and occasionally Jonathan brought a store-bought pie to share. Lily Chen and Mr. Henderson came to games and clapped when Ethan ran bases. Claire called to check in, and Dr. Mendoza charted progress. Ethan began to sleep through the night more often and to laugh in bursts that surprised him. "I had a dream where the swing never stopped," he told Jonathan once, and Jonathan listened as if he were taking notes on how to hold the fragile thing inside the boy. As months passed, Ethan's schoolwork improved and his social circle expanded by degrees. He learned to trust a few people and to test others. The small victories were sensory. A warm hand on his shoulder at a recital, the taste of pizza without fear, the smell of autumn and roast chestnuts on a Saturday afternoon. His vocabulary around emotions widened through therapy, and he could say, "I felt scared when he left," without recoil. Progress was documented in reports and in personal notes that gathered like kindling for future fires of hope. One of the most poignant moments of reclaiming life occurred when Ethan picked up the baseball and wrote on it a new promise in block letters: "I will try." He placed it in a small glass jar on his bedside table so the sun could catch it in the morning and make it look golden. Jonathan noticed and did not comment on the awkward syntax. Marcus later read it, and the words landed like a soft instruction to both men. This was the work. Epilogue, 1 month later, showed small, steady changes. Ethan had settled into a routine with school and therapy, and the jar of promises sat on his dresser catching the morning light. Marcus had begun a part-time job with a local hardware store and attended parental counseling twice weekly. Jonathan visited on weekends and coordinated with the school to sponsor an after-school club that offered tutoring and baseball practice. The neighborhood that once watched with distant curiosity now offered warm nods and questions about Ethan's progress. Phone calls were scheduled and kept. Ethan learned to trust a schedule and to expect that someone would indeed show up. The emotional landscape felt less like a raw wound and more like a carefully healing scar. 3 months later, the relationships had deepened into routines and fuller commitments. Ethan excelled in baseball, not as a prodigy, but as a child who had found joy. Marcus had completed a 6-week financial counseling program and demonstrated steady employment, attending supervised visits that became less charged and more conversational. Jonathan had set up an educational trust and met with Dr. Mendoza to evaluate progress, making sure therapy continued uninterrupted. The legal status remained guardianship, with a clear path outlined for reunification should Marcus meet certain benchmarks. Ethan's laughter began to surface more easily, and his trust, while guarded, stretched its boundaries. The community organized a small fundraiser that paid for a field trip, and names like Lily Chen, Rosa Garcia, Mr. Henderson, and Claire Thompson became part of Ethan's network. The bonds that formed were not only legal, but human, stitched by food, by conversation, by presence. 6 months after the bench, the transformation was visible but incomplete. The court reviewed Marcus's progress and extended monitored overnight visits on the weekends. Ethan had developed a steady rhythm at school and had a circle of friends who mostly accepted him without question. Jonathan remained a consistent force, not a savior in a simplistic sense, but a man who used his resources to create stability and to step back when that was required. Marcus and Ethan shared a laugh over a burnt pancake that Marcus accidentally made, a small milestone in the work of reclaiming a relationship. The final hearing considered more permanent guardianship options, balancing Marcus's demonstrated improvement against the child's ongoing need for stability. Judge Ramirez praised the efforts and emphasized support and accountability. In the end, the legal status shifted toward a long-term plan emphasizing co-parenting, monitored by Riverside Social Services and with regular reports to the court. The path was not neat, but it was honest. Ethan said Dad with Marcus at times, and at others he said Mr. Reed. And one evening in a small kitchen that smelled of garlic and radio static, he said the word home, and everyone in the room felt it land like a small miracle. The community that had watched a boy on a bench had helped to rewrite the rest. This story is about promise and how it can be broken, and about how a promise given by someone else can sometimes mend what was torn. Jonathan Reed's kindness did not erase the past. It provided a scaffold for repair and a set of choices that allowed a child and a struggling father to begin again. The lesson is complicated. Money cannot replace parenting, and generosity cannot be a substitute for accountability. Yet, when paired with careful oversight and genuine humility, it can open doors that had been shut. What began as abandonment concluded with a community, a court, therapists, coaches, and one wealthy man who chose not to look away.
If you watched this and felt moved, tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what you would do next.
If you found a child on a bench, start your comment with "I would," so others know how you would act. Your words matter. They help others decide how to respond in a moment where choices are raw and urgent. We read every comment, and your stories become part of how communities learn to care better. But the rest of the story shows how the smallest acts of presence can reshape a life. Ethan's darkest hour did not define him. It became a hinge. He learned to accept help and to give it back in small ways. He learned to name his feelings and to ask for time when his chest tightened. Marcus learned that shame is a poor counselor, and that redemption demands steady work, small acts that accumulate into trust. Jonathan learned that philanthropy without listening can fail, and that the kindest gestures are those disciplined by restraint and respect. Rosa Garcia kept making Sunday dinners. Lily Chen organized a volunteer roster. Mr. Henderson continued to coach. Claire Thompson monitored progress and wrote notes that would one day be read as evidence of rescue. Dr. Mendoza wrote assessments that became roadmaps for repair. Judge Ramirez followed with compassion and clarity. In the quiet moments, Ethan would sometimes take the baseball from the jar and rub the letters where he had written, "I will try." The words were imperfect, but he kept them close, a talisman against the days when fear crawled back in. His future was not guaranteed, but it had new terrain and new people who would not let him fall without being noticed. This story ends with a phrase that is simple and true. Compassion finds the cracks and, if tended, lets light in. If this story moved you, please subscribe for more real-life narratives and share your thoughts below.